time for a couple of questions. Chris.
Thank you very much. Mr. Duncan Smith, one of the problems that people have with politicians is they do one thing and then they go and say another. Now, you were a member of the Cabinet when it signed off on the welfare break. You campaigned on it in the Conservative manifesto just this time last year, and now you're giving interviews to newspapers saying it was all a big German stitch-up and we're just puppets of Angela Merkel. How can people possibly trust you when you've told them that?
Well, because the negotiation process had not even really begun. The whole point about our election was to offer a referendum, and let me bring you back to the terms of that referendum. It was for the UK to decide on whether to remain in a reformed European Union or to leave an unreformed European Union. Now, that is the very terms that were set both by the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. And as you know, the only thing that was on offer and promised was the completion of those negotiations to give us a full reform package. What I signed up to, quite legitimately, in the run to the election, was that proposal, that we would bring forward a fully reformed European Union and then hold that referendum by 2017. So I'm very happy to stand by that. I wanted to see that done. I was in favour of the Prime Minister's Bloomberg speech, and I thought that, plus his proposals to get border control, would have actually meant we would have had a very different relationship within the European Union, and that would have justified actually remaining in. So the key question is, did we get that reformed European Union? And the point is, I don't believe we did. We had a very small number of little things that have happened, but worse, we had to give away our veto over what actually happens inside the euro now. And so that makes us, in a sense, more vulnerable than we were before. So I have a very simple statement in answer to that question is, the debate was about, and should be about, did we get a reformed European Union? When you look at the European Union, is it reformed? Is it fundamentally different from what it was when we set out on this process, having been so critical of what was happening in the European Union? And the answer, I'm afraid, has to be categorically, no, we did not get a reformed European Union. And so the logical position, both for the government and for somebody like me, is to therefore say we have to leave the European Union.
You could have told us that on February the 20th, or whenever the date was after David Cameron came back from those negotiations, and you didn't.
We didn't complete the negotiations. I'm sorry, we did not complete the negotiations until far later on. I was still working on stuff to do with what we would do about benefit claimants way into last year, and even the final agreement about what would have happened, which came out of the Commission, the final proposal, wasn't even agreed until early this year. So the negotiations were not complete. No, I'm sorry. You stand on an election platform was very clear. We would have a full negotiation and come back with a reformed European Union. The negotiations did not complete until early this year. Then the proposal was put forward that it's now time for a vote, because the Prime Minister said we had a reformed European Union, and everybody else said, I'm sorry, we do not.
Craig, do you have a question?
Craig Woodhouse from The Sun. Two questions, if I may. Can I ask you to join the dots? You've painted a fairly stark picture of what uncontrolled immigration is going to do to the future of the country. You've also given an interview about how Angela Merkel blocked a migrant break. Do you blame David Cameron or Angela Merkel or both for what's coming? And secondly, by any stretch of the imagination, David Cameron is one of life's haves. Do you think he understands the plight of have-nots as you've set it out?
Yeah, let me just deal with this. What I've actually said categorically is uncontrolled migration has been very damaging to British people at the lower income scale and the lower skill level, because all the evidence, and this is not me making this up, all the evidence demonstrates, and today I raised it, that the European Union's policy of uncontrolled migration to the UK has meant the competition for jobs has driven wages down, caused real problems about access to housing and also to schools and even to healthcare. So those are the reasons why we want controlled migration. We're not against migration. We want to be able to select those key people who bring something and add value to the UK, rather than just having everybody come in and take the lower paid and the unskilled jobs. My point about this is that was meant to be the process and the purpose of what we were negotiating, and that was always in that discussion. The Prime Minister wanted to achieve that. That was what he set out to achieve. My criticism lies in the fact that we should face up to the fact, and I hope the government should face up to that fact, that the European Union has demonstrated, even with Britain voting potentially to leave the European Union, They are absolutely point-blank refusing to change what they do. So there is the answer. As we've gone through this process saying that there is going to be a vote, and even with the prospect of the fifth largest economy leaving the European Union Commission and all the structures won't change. So that's the lesson we take away from that. It's not about an individual, it's about the reality that you cannot change this because it will not change. And that means we have to leave because we don't have a reformed European Union. And therefore, the proposal that we have a reformed European Union, I'm afraid, doesn't stand. So it's not about Mrs. Merkel, it's not about the Prime Minister, it's about the fact that nobody in the European Union wants to change pretty much anything that they do, and that's what we're left with. I do believe he does. I absolutely do believe. I've had conversations with him. I think he recognizes that. This is not anything other than a reality check, though. The fact is that, you know, we want people to be better off at the lower level of income. That has been one of the great purposes. I want the quality of life for those who are in lower pay to be improving. But the biggest block we have is that the competition that they face directly as a result of uncontrolled migration has caused real problems about assimilation in those communities and a real threat to their incomes. And I think, therefore, there are limits to what the British government can do as long as we have uncontrolled migration. And controlled migration is the key, and it's clear that the European Union and the countries of the European Union don't want to have that.
Jason Gross from the Daily Mail. Hi. The PM said, sorry, you mentioned Turkey a couple of times in your speech today and the prospect of Turkey joining and further migration flows. The PM said last week voters shouldn't worry about Turkey. Turkey's not on the ballot paper this time. Is he being straight with people, do you think?
Well, Turkey is on the ballot paper because the European Union is on the ballot paper. As I understand it, unless I was wrong, that I think the Prime Minister and others said that they wanted to have a road paved from Brussels to Ankara. Was it going to stop suddenly and we're going to down tools? The reality is the European Union has made it very clear. First of all, they're going to get visa-free travel, access to the European Union, which is going to be a huge step for Turkey and other countries. And then, of course, the next stage is for them to enter the European Union. You know, the negotiations will begin. They were told that the part of the deal for getting legal migrants back from Greece to Turkey has been that they would get accelerated negotiations. So it is on the ballot paper. Everything to do with the European Union is on the ballot paper. And the key point I'd make is if you vote to remain in the European Union, the risks are enormous. Uncontrolled migration, the arrival of new nation states who have much lower income levels than the UK does, when the UK is going to put its minimum wage up to £9 an hour. The draw for people to come here will be enormous, and our cost, you know, we spend £350 million a week now. Just imagine how much more we're going to have to put into the budget to be able to sustain those countries that are now about to enter who are much poorer.
Owen Bennett, Huffington Post. Mr. Duncan Smith, is there not a contradiction?
Oh, there you are, sorry, yeah.
Is it not a contradiction that you say that the German-led EU is so unwilling to be flexible with negotiations with the UK in this process, and yet when the UK leaves, it'll be able to get a kind of bespoke deal in order to access a single market? Surely they'll say you have to have a deal similar to, say, the Norwegian model. And also, Alan Johnson today said that people on your side of the argument are actually extremists in this debate,
yeah, okay.
and I wondered if you'd like to respond to that.
I don't know in what world it's extreme to want to have your democracy back, the power over what you do, control over your laws, and the right to make decisions about your people elected by British people and rejected by British people when you get it wrong. If someone wants to tell me that's an extreme position, then I want to know what defines that. It is not extreme to want democratic government in your country to be responsible to the electorate and to make the laws that best help them rather than to have 60% of those laws made in Brussels. So I have to say, those people in the Remain really need to stop throwing threats and ridiculous terms like that around, because it just demeans them and it demeans the debate. And the point is, the fifth largest economy in the world, set to grow to be the fourth largest economy in the world in the next few years, with the fourth most powerful defence structures. Are you telling me, with a trade deficit with the rest of the European Union, we aren't going to be able to arrive at a deal which is particular to the UK? I don't think so. I think they'll do that straight away.
Hi, Joe Churchill from the Press Association. You said in your speech, or just now the questions, that the EU uncontrolled migration is the biggest block to people getting employment in this country. In 2010, you said that immigrants were taking all the jobs because people in this country weren't capable or able to take those jobs. Are both of those things true? Or?
No, the reality has always been, I've been very clear about this, that the uncontrolled migration, if you look at the numbers that are coming in, the vast proportion of jobs that have been taken by those coming in from the EU through uncontrolled migration have been low-skilled and lower-paid jobs. You know, for those that keep carping on about, oh, it's about people coming in, you know, software experts, it's not. It's the vast majority on an uncontrolled basis have been coming in competing for jobs where we have a lot of British people who will be seeking those jobs, and I want them to be able to take them, and I want to be able to take them at a reasonable level of salary, which is why I'm very keen on the rise of the minimum wage. So my point is very simple. You know, uncontrolled migration puts pressure on those people not to be able to take those jobs because they get undercut for the very reasons that I gave earlier on. So, no, I said because we hadn't equipped many of them to compete with many other people coming in, and we had to do more about that, and we did, which is why we got numbers back into work. But it still meant that the overall salaries that were paid were less. The Bank of England has made that absolutely clear. So even in getting into work, the problem has been that they've actually earned less than they should have done had it been a competition in the UK rather than with this uncontrolled migration, bringing numbers in, competing at the lower level with no housing costs, and with very low family costs indeed in the UK, and that's the big business. You know, there's one person said to me at the job centre when I was there, he was an electrician, he said, I have family costs, I have a family, I have a house to look after, you know, I have all those relevant costs. The people I'm competing with do not have those costs when they come in and do these 6 months or 9 months temporary.
Hello, Dario Thuburn from AFP News Agency. I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the German chair and whether that was a sort of a one-off reference, or is that something that was joked about regularly at cabinet meetings. Also, if these arguments are true, there should be more parties elsewhere in Europe advocating a departure from the European Union. Yeah. And why is that not the case?
Let me deal with the last first. This is the point about flexibility within the European Union that is critical. Different countries have different requirements. For example, you know, Germany faces a problem of a falling birth rate, which they've had for some time, and they have relied hugely on migrant workers. The UK has a rising birth rate, and therefore we have not needed that because we're already within the UK. We have many people who are able to take those jobs, and younger people coming through at a much higher rate than they have in Germany. So there are differences. My point is, I'm not asking for one size fits all. I'm asking, as we are asking, for what is relevant to our country. And in controlling your borders, we want to make sure that we're able to control the scale, but also to be able to select people who really advance the UK. You know, we may need software engineers, we may need industrial engineers of some particular scale. Those are the kind of people we might want to bring in, even for the health service. And the other bit is that by not having control over your borders in the EU, it's meant we've had to tighten up dramatically on our borders to outside the EU. So that means we're not able to bring in certain numbers of people, which people are complaining about right now. It's all down to not having control of your own borders. I think that answers your question.
Thank you. My name is Rahman, fourth leaf campaigner from Indonesia. Sir, I just would like to know, is it the supremacy of the European Court of Justice, the ECJ, is it written in any treaty? And if it is, what happens if a member country simply ignore their dictate, saying, well, it is against our interests, and we just simply don't want to follow your dictate? Thank you very much.
It's a good question, because the European Court of Justice has declared itself as supreme. It is supreme. It's supreme over all matters European. And that the scale of that involvement with Europe has grown over the years. So they have become essentially supreme in very many matters that are directly concerning domestic policy here in the UK. What happens? I'll tell you exactly what happens is you're warned that unless you comply by the European Commission, they will take you to the European Court of Justice. If you continue not to do this, then they start infraction proceedings. And that process can take whatever, a year or so before it comes in front of the European Court of Justice, and in most cases, occasionally not, they find against you if it is clear and explicit that you have actually broken what is essentially a European regulation or a law. I have been infracted, myself. It's not a painful process, but I have to say that I encouraged them to do it because I actually disagreed with what they were saying at the time, although they never actually finally proceeded, possibly maybe because the referendum was coming up, who knows. Well, if you continue to ignore, you just keep getting fined, and so it goes on. And sometimes some countries just ignore some of these things, and they find the penalties that pile up on them.
Just got two last questions, one from Alex and then from your constituency.
Thank you, Alex Forsyth, BBC News. Just a point, the visa-free access being proposed for Turkey is for the Schengen zone, so aren't you, by suggesting the impact of EU expansion, uncontrolled immigration on schools and housing, just indulging in Project Fear? And secondly, on the renegotiation of David Cameron, isn't the point of a negotiation to compromise and reach agreement? Aren't you just hyping up the role of Germany to portray the UK as weak to further your own campaign?
Okay, let me deal with the first question, which is, hang on a second, access to Europe and joining the European Union is part of the process, okay? So there is no proposal that says Turkey or Macedonia, others will not now start processes to join the European Union. I'm talking about what is coming down the tracks is the membership of these other countries to the European Union. And the point is, once you are a member, you have the right of access into the UK because we have no right to withhold that from you. It's also worth pointing out that there are parts of the, well, let's say the whole of the European Union, if somebody is in the European Union for a period of time, can get citizenship if they've come over here into the Germany or whatever as a migrant within a period of years. Different countries have different timescales. Some even sold passports to people. But the point is that that means they will access the UK at a fairly reasonably fast rate. So my point here is that the entry of Turkey and the others is part of this debate, because we're not voting about where we are just today. People who vote Remain and stay in the European Union need to know what's coming down the tracks is a remarkable set of changes to make things even worse, in my book, than they are already. Going back to the negotiations, look, the purpose of negotiation is to achieve as much of your objectives as you possibly can and then decide whether or not, on balance, you agree it or you don't agree it. It's not compromise. Compromise is a tool to achieve your objectives. Compromise is not the objective in itself. And that is the problem with the European Union. It becomes compromise for its own sake so that nothing gets damaged in the European Union. My view very categorically is the Bloomberg speech, followed by that key point about having control over our own borders, would have given us, I think, a very strong different status, which would have been then much more likely to achieve the votes of those who might want to remain, because we would have a really self-governing process in there and make the rest of the European Union change their ways to make it more flexible and better. None of that was achieved. What we ended up with achieving was a compromise, and that compromise satisfies pretty much absolutely nobody and leaves us weaker, in my book.
John Moss, I'm a London councillor. In 1992, Sir John Major said the Maastricht Treaty represented the high watermark of European integration, and you rebelled against his government. Was he right, or were you?
Far be it from me to criticise the previous Prime Minister, but I will say very simply this. The reason I voted against Maastricht all those years ago was because I felt that if we passed Maastricht with all its QMV, qualified majority voting, which enabled us to be outvoted in key areas, what we would see then was a process that would just continue to make that worse. And I said at the time that if we did that, then there would be only one decision to make finally, which is, do we stay in the European Union, or do we agree to lose our sovereign position as a nation state because so much of our lawmaking power and our democracy would be taken away? I like to believe that what I argued then turned out to be right. I was not actually in favour of leaving the European Union at that point, because I thought there was still a chance that we could change that or even reverse it. But after Maastricht and Nice and Amsterdam and Lisbon, you can see that the huge scale of the change that has taken place has led us to exactly the point that I originally said, which is we now have a choice. When you vote to remain in the European Union, you vote not for just static processes. You now vote for continuing, grinding away, the taking away of power from nation states, and the slow process of building up what is essentially a federal union with all its problems. And that means right now there is no chance of negotiating a change. It is to say simply, it's time to leave.
Final question, back in front.
Beth Rigby, Sky News. Mr. Duncan Smith, you said in this speech that being in the EU has led to an explosion of have-nots, low-pay workers losing out. The PM argued quite powerfully yesterday that those who think we would be better off outside the single market are both reckless and irresponsible. And he also said that leaving the EU would hurt ordinary people, it would hurt their jobs, it would hurt their livelihoods. So my question really is, do you think the Prime Minister's been dishonest with the British people about that, or is he just merely misguided?
I just don't agree with him over that, I'm afraid. And, you know, this is a debate, and people will have to take what they find. I think the speech I made today demonstrates categorically by the data produced and by the sense and fact. You know, you go around these communities and you talk to people like this, as I have done endlessly, you will find there is a deep concern about what is happening to them as a result of uncontrolled migration, and also this huge wave of regulation that has poured down on the heads of small businesses, as I said, most of whom never do any business in European Union at all. I make this simple point. Therefore, in disagreeing, I actually believe that we will be economically better off because we're able to make the decisions that are necessary going in the future. And I think the choice here to be made is not about are there risks only with leaving, which is what the Remain group say, against absolutely everything steady and stable by staying in. I think the truth is the decision is about huge risks of staying in. I've already said some of them about, you know, entry of new states coming in much poorer, huge problems over migration being out of control, real issues about, you know, problems about controlling our borders against terrorism, being less secure as a result of all of that, and the economic crisis that is rumbling on and on and on in the European Union, causing massive levels of unemployment, high levels of inactivity and bank insolvency, and that is only going to get worse. Versus leaving, which of course, you know, we're going to be taking our own decisions to go in the future, and I don't say there won't be risk, but I say this, and this is the key point. On the balance of the two, I believe that Britain, this country, this United Kingdom, is better off facing the challenges of the future, and there will be challenges, by controlling its response to those challenges itself, through its democratic government elected and changed by people if we don't get it right. I believe we're better off by doing it ourselves than by having to give way to 27 other nations and more to come who may not have the same priorities as we do and who then make things happen that we may not want to happen. And you can see that in some of the trade negotiations, the trade deals, the regulations, the issues around the city being forced to be less competitive as a result of EU regulations coming down the track. My point is, if we are that independent nation, we're not leaving Europe. We're voting to leave the European Union. We will remain friends. We will be cooperating. We will trade. And we will get on defense matters and intelligence matters. And anybody tells you that is not true, they are simply telling you something which is wrong. The fact is, we will exist and be happy compatriots with all of our friends and neighbours. That is what makes us. And by the way, I'm fed up with British governments going over and carping and complaining in the European Union. I want to bring that to an end by having us have a much better relationship with them. So it's about who decides the future response to challenges that you face. I believe instinctively that the British people are brilliant enough to be able to take those challenges head on, and their government will act on their behalf and will be better off.